Donald Trump's nuclear reaction. Is he right about Iran? The US president is refusing to recertify the nuclear deal signed 2 years ago and accuses the Iranians of breaking the agreement. Iran says his allegations are delusional and world leaders are also critical. This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Welcome to Inside Story. After months of bold talk and threats against Iran, the US president is laying out a new strategy to challenge the leadership in Tehran. Donald Trump's refusing to certify the major nuclear deal signed with Iran 2 years ago. The Obama administration and 6 world powers agreed to lift long-running sanctions in return for Iranian promises to limit nuclear weapons development. Trump says Iran is not meeting the conditions of the agreement, but stops short of completely withdrawing from it. Instead, he's asking Congress to consider new sanctions on Iran.
By its own terms, the Iran deal was supposed to contribute to regional and international peace and security. And yet, while the United States adheres to our commitment under the deal, the Iranian regime continues to fuel conflict, terror, and turmoil throughout the Middle East and beyond.
It didn't take long for Iran's president to hit back at what he called Trump's pile of delusional allegations. Hassan Rouhani says Iran will play by its own terms.
We will continue to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency in the framework of international treaties. But if someday our interests are not realized and other parties want to violate their commitments, they should be aware that Iran will not hesitate a moment and will respond to them.
Let's introduce our panel now. From Washington, D.C., Ali Vaez, who's senior analyst at the International Crisis Group. From Tehran, Mustafa Khoshashem, who's a university professor at the Applied Sciences University, as well as a journalist and political commentator. We're also joined in Washington by Daryl Kimball, who's the executive director of the Arms Control Association. Welcome to you all. I'm sure you all have opinions about this, and we'll discuss where we go from here. But first, I think, for our viewers, let's explain exactly what happened. I'll start with you, Daryl. What is desertification?
Well, what President Trump just did was to fail to report to Congress that, in his view, Iran is meeting certain conditions. Now, this is a U.S. law that was passed after the conclusion of the Iran nuclear deal, the agreement between Iran, 6 world powers, and the European Union. And he said, President Trump said yesterday, that in his opinion, the sanctions relief granted to Iran under the deal is not proportionate to the steps that Iran has taken to severely restrict its nuclear activities. And so what that does is it opens the door to Congress reconsidering the application of sanctions or other legislation relating to the deal. And we've heard from Senator Bob Corker, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, that he is going to be pursuing legislation that would impose additional sanctions on Iran if Iran does not extend the limits, the time that the JCPOA limits are due to apply to Iran. And that amounts to a unilateral attempt to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. And that's why Iran, the Europeans, are saying that they're going to stand by the agreement. They're not going to stand for a unilateral attempt to renegotiate the terms of this international accord. Now, what Congress does, we're not quite sure. We're going to have a months-long debate here in Washington that my organization, the Arms Control Association, is going to be deeply engaged in. So the future of the Iran nuclear deal does hang in the balance.
So, Ali, to be clear, nothing has actually happened to that deal. I remember I was there in Vienna with you when it was signed back in September 2015. Nothing's actually happened under that deal. This is the act of Congress that was there to scrutinise and monitor the deal, and President Trump reporting back to Congress. What's your understanding of exactly the legislation that President Trump now wants? Is he trying now, rather than to have a monitoring act, to actually have a second mechanism that judges compliance?
Look, I think the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act that was passed under the Obama administration was designed to basically keep the Obama administration's foot to fire and force them to certify every 90 days that the nuclear deal remains in the U.S. national interest. And this was something that President Trump also twice certified, but he did so every time very grudgingly. And I think he just wanted to get out of that. And decertification has allowed him now to toss it back to Congress. And as Daryl mentioned, Congress has 60 days to reimpose sanctions if it deems expedient to do so. I think that is a very unlikely outcome. Congress is not going to reimpose sanctions because Iran remains compliant with its obligations under the deal, as it has been verified by the UN agency in charge of monitoring Iran's implementation of the deal, even by President Trump's own State Department. So what is going to happen is that Congress is likely going to change the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act and add new conditions to it. So it would take away the certification, and it would probably attach the snapback of sanctions to conditions that are not in the nuclear deal. For example, it would say if after 10 years Iran starts ramping up its nuclear program as it has been allowed by the nuclear deal, then Congress will snap back sanctions. Or if Iran moves to develop its ballistic missile program further and moves towards longer range missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, then sanctions will snap back automatically. Now, the problem with this is that this is a unilateral alteration of a multilateral deal that has been enshrined by a UN Security Council. And this is, in fact, blackmailing and twisting the arms of U.S. allies to come join it in violating the agreement and forcing the Iranians to accept conditions that were not part of the deal in return for nothing. So basically, the administration wants its partners to join it in pushing the Iranians to accept less for more. And I think that's an impossibility.
Mustafa, it's not just the nuclear deal that was announced, or what he was going to do with regard to certification of the nuclear deal that was announced by President Trump. There was another piece to his strategy, which was fresh sanctions on the Revolutionary Guard. What does that mean?
Well, you know, since Obama started the engagement policy, there were critics in Tehran who would say that the United States is not just trying to resolve differences over the nuclear issue, but it's trying to wear off the components of power of Iran that include its nuclear deterrence, missile capability, as well as its regional clout and influence. Now, after a couple of years, even those who have pinned hope on, talks with the United States, like the President Rouhani's administration, they have even now come to realize that critics were right, and the United States apparently does not mean at all to resolve the differences. It's trying to harness Iran, to control Iran, and to win concessions from Iran that it failed to win in the battlefield, like in Syria, where the United States has lost its role along with its allies like Saudi Arabia. They are not major players in there anymore, and they have failed to hold and to keep and maintain their power in there. They want to pressure Tehran to give these concessions and to revive their role through diplomacy, through sanctions, and through talks. Now, this is not going to work because the main target of the antagonistic efforts made by Donald Trump and the U.S., the establishment in the U.S., are directed at wearing off these two components, the missile industry as well as the regional clout. And the IRGC is responsible for these two areas of power of Iran. That's why everyone in Tehran, from the people to the administration officials to the leader, everyone has thrown his weight behind the IRGC. And the successful experience of the IRGC chief commander's threats a few days ago to Donald Trump that if the U.S. designates the IRGC as a terrorist organization, they would reciprocate that with a similar designation of the U.S. Army as a terrorist entity and behave them and treat them like ISIL in the region. And that, of course, includes similar treatment by Hezbollah, Hamas, and other Iranian allies in the region. That would incur a lot of costs on the U.S., and it was successful in deterring the U.S. president and announcement and designation of, keeping away from his promises to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Now, people in Tehran that have seen this successful experience, they are demanding similar action by the government. So the public in Tehran, even those who have voted for Rouhani, they are asking for a tougher tone, and the IRGC has gathered much support. I personally have never seen such, full support by all, political wings from across the spectrum, as well as people in Iran across the country, and even people outside the country who have all come to realize that they need now to support the IRGC.
Let's discuss not only what the Trump administration did, but also that speech and what President Trump said and the way he said it. Daryl, to me, it seemed to match the General Assembly speech of almost a month earlier with its fiery tone. And it was so different from a briefing that was given in the White House, off-camera briefing by the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, that I listened into on a conference call. The tone could not have been more different. And in the speech, Trump said, so different again from Secretary of State Tillerson, who said that Iran was in compliance with the deal, that there had been multiple violations. Is that true?
Well, you're right. This was a typical Donald Trump fire-breathing speech filled with a number of statements that I think really amount to innuendo. What he has been saying is that Iran has not met its obligations under the Iran nuclear deal. He has cited a couple of things. The fact that in January of 2016, Iran very briefly exceeded the limit established on heavy water, which is used as a moderator for certain kinds of reactors. That violation was actually minor in scope. It lasted for a couple of weeks, and Iran went back into compliance. The reality is that Iran is in compliance with its heavy water limits and all the other complex and stringent commitments mandated by the Iran nuclear deal. He also alleged that Iran has intimidated the IAEA so that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, does not request inspections of Iranian military facilities that might be engaged in nuclear activities, prohibited nuclear activities. Now, we have to remember the Iran nuclear deal established a broader mandate for the International Atomic Energy Agency, not just to visit declared nuclear facilities, but also to conduct snap inspections of those facilities, as well as Iran's uranium mines, its centrifuge manufacturing facilities, and there have been some 400 snap inspections conducted by the IAEA since the Iran deal was implemented 1.5 years ago. And what Trump is alleging is that the IAEA has not exercised its full authority to conduct challenge inspections of certain facilities that the IAEA believes may be involved in activities prohibited by the JCPOA, weapons-related activities. The IAEA said, the Director General, Yuki Amano, said in response to Donald Trump, we have had the full authority and we have inspected the facilities that we need to inspect in order to ensure that Iran is fully complying with the terms of the deal. So this, again, I think is innuendo. It's a suggestion that there may be a problem where there hasn't been quite yet. And so, Trump is trying as best he can to suggest incorrectly that Iran is somehow violating its nuclear commitments.
Ali, it's not just the IAEA. there are those close to Trump, his top advisors. We mentioned the Secretary of State, but the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they've all said that technically, under the deal, Iran is complying. I was on a number of conference calls in the last 24 hours to another one by former Obama administration officials, including the Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama, Ben Rhodes. Let me just read you his quote, Ali. "You're looking at an administration that's contorting itself in order to justify the irrational decision of the president."
Look, I couldn't agree more. The reality is the president couldn't even base its decision based on the allegation that Iran has not complied with the deal. He used the idea that Daryl mentioned previously, which is that sanctions relief is not proportionate to Iran's actions under the deal in order to decertify. He couldn't use non-compliance as justification. So I think there is no doubt that the decision was taken based on other reasons, based on the fact that the president does not like this deal. He had put himself in a rhetorical corner by repeatedly calling it a bad deal and an embarrassment for the United States, even before becoming president, that he just simply couldn't live with this 90-day certification, which was a real burden on his shoulders. Now, the real question is, does decertification actually improve Iran's behavior across the board on some other issues that the president mentioned in his speech, including Iran's role in the region? And I think if one has an understanding of the sources of Iranian conduct in the region, one would come to the conclusion that putting Iran under more pressure and threatening Iran across the board and arming its regional rivals more and more would only result in a more aggressive Iranian behavior in the region. I think one issue that the president fundamentally does not understand is that if he truly believes that Iran is part of the problem in the region and in the turmoil that we see in the region, then by definition and inescapably, Iran will also have to be part of the solution.
Mustafa, when you're there in Iran and you're talking to people who heard the Trump speech, what do they make of some of this language? Repeatedly, he called it Iran's dictatorship. He said early on in the speech, Iran is under the control of a fanatical regime that seized power in 1979 and forced a proud people to submit to its extremist rule. How does that go down there?
Well, apparently, many people, they hate Trump for this kind of language. He's using harsh words. His literature is rich with aggressive words and insults, and this has antagonized Iranians even more, even those that are not very much political people or they don't have political tendencies, as well as those that might be even, not interested in the Islamic Revolution or the ruling system. They have come, forward to stand up to Donald Trump. They rush to Instagram, Twitter, and other social media networks in order to file their complaints, especially when he misnamed the waterway, the Persian Gulf, and he called it Arabian Gulf. He antagonized many, even those that are considered as opposition of the Islamic Republic abroad. They also condemned Trump for this kind of language. So he, I believe, is trying to, intensify his rhetorics against Iran in order to show the height of animosity. But when it comes to action, he refrains from taking actions after his withdrawal with regard to the Paris Agreement, NAFTA, and returning, reimposing sanctions on Cuba and going, to after unraveling the moves that were made by Obama. He has come to realize that his actions incur costs on his reputation, his own reputation. So with regard to the deal, he wants, a result, but he is not ready to, pay the costs. So
Okay.
he is
Mustafa,
the Congress to pay the cost for his policies.
Mustafa, one other thing that President Trump said, and I know the fact checkers have been busy on his speech, was all about this money. He's talking about $100 billion that had been given to the regime, he said. The regime also received a massive cash settlement of $1.7 billion from the US. And when he talked about this, he seemed to use the sort of language still of a property salesman.
The saddest part of the deal for the United States is that all of the money was paid up front, which is unheard of, rather than at the end of the deal when they have shown they've played by the rules.
You can fact check that for us, Ali.
I'm not sure if the president has actually read the agreement and understood the process properly. Look, if you look to the arguments of critics inside Iran, it's completely the other way around. They argue that the way that the deal was implemented, Iran had to actually first start by dismantling hundreds and thousands of centrifuges, by shipping out 97% of its stockpile of enriched uranium, by putting cement in its heavy water reactor before it received a dime of its own money. So Iranians would have to actually deliver first on their end of the bargain before they would be rewarded with the sanctions relief that was devised in the JCPOA. And the president talks about the money that Iran received as a result of a legal settlement in The Hague, as if this money was paid to Iran from U.S. taxpayers' pockets, whereas this was Iran's money that was frozen as a result of an aborted agreement from the time of the Shah in U.S. bank accounts for purchase of weapons that after 30-odd years was returned to Iran. And because of U.S. sanctions that were not properly rolled back, there was no way other than sending it to the Iranians by cash. So this is the fact about what the president was complaining.
Let's discuss what the partners of the US, particularly the other 5 countries that negotiated with Iran, what they think about this. And I think probably the strongest reaction came from the EU High Representative, who came out moments later with a point-by-point rebuttal, including this thing that President Trump said.
In the event we are not able to reach a solution working with Congress and our allies, then the agreement will be terminated. It is under continuous review, and our participation can be canceled by me as president at any time.
It's clearly not in the hands of any president of any country in the world to terminate an agreement of this sort, because this is a UN Security Council resolution. This is a plan of action that sets things to be done, commitments, nuclear-related commitments, and only nuclear-related commitments, and that is being implemented. So the President of the United States has many powers, not this one.
Darrell, what does this mean, not just for the Iran deal, but for the US's reputation in doing deals around the world?
It doesn't do us any good, to be quite honest. The international community operates on the assumption that a government that negotiates and signs an agreement will continue to respect that agreement even if there is a change in government. We've seen this throughout the decades in the 20th century, the 21st century. But what Donald Trump is doing here, not just with the Iran nuclear deal, but with the Paris Climate Accord and other agreements, he is clearly giving the international community the impression that by negotiating with the United States, you cannot trust that agreement, that deal will be respected in the next administration.
Ali, very quickly, very quickly, of course, this is a time when you have now a growing nuclear crisis with Iran, but also one with North Korea. 2 growing emergencies.
Yes, and I think the effect of what President Trump is doing with the Iran deal is that the North Koreans would look at this situation and they would say, what's the point in dealing with the United States? you agree to give away most of your nuclear capabilities in return for sanctions relief that is much less than what has been promised. And as soon as the administration changes, Washington goes back on its word and decides to negotiate another deal. So I think the North Koreans would have absolutely zero incentive to settle the current standoff with the United States in a diplomatic way.
Well, thank you very much to our guests, three real experts on this subject, Ali Vaez, Daryl Kimball and Mustafa Khoshashem. And thank you too for watching. You can find plenty more stories about the Iran deal, and you can even watch this programme again if you want on our website, aljazeera.com. And if you have strong views on today's topic, you can join the conversation on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Alternatively, use the Twitter, where we are at AJ Inside Story. That's it from me, James Bays, and the whole team. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.